August 24, 410 AD. The Salarian Gate shudders under a sudden concentrated blow. Men pour through the breach into the ancient heart of Rome. Not painted tribesmen screaming war cries in a foreign tongue, soldiers in equipment they learned to wear under Roman standards. Their commander is Alaric, man who has held Roman military rank for 15 years. His troops have served as Roman, proud foederati, trained in Roman formations, armed with Roman weapons, fed on Roman promises. The city they are entering has already been abandoned by its emperor, court, and its grain supply. What is about to happen has been sold to history as an invasion of barbarian hordes, but the Visigoths were not barbarians. They were Roman soldiers who had been promised land 3 times and given nothing. To understand why this sack occurred, and why Rome could not stop it, you have to go back 34 years to a river crossing on the far edge of the empire. The Danube, 376 AD. A mass of humanity presses against the northern bank, roughly 100,000 people, not an army, but a migration. They are the Thervingi branch of the Goths, fleeing a disaster that Roman intelligence had barely registered. The Huns. Behind them, the grasslands are burning. Ahead, the river marks the imperial frontier. And on the other side, Roman officers watch from fortified positions. The Goths send envoys. They ask for permission to cross, to settle on vacant land inside Roman territory, to farm and to serve. The emperor in Constantinople, Valens, grants the request. On paper, it is a routine imperial transaction. Absorb a displaced population, use them as recruits, expand the tax base. The reality on the ground is administered by regional commanders who see a captive market, not a military asset. The refugees are stripped of their weapons, corralled into holding camps, and then systematically exploited. Roman officials sell them spoiled grain at extortionate prices. Contemporary accounts record that dog meat was exchanged for children sold into slavery. 1 dog, 1 child. The Visigoths have been inside the empire for less than a year. The empire has already broken every promise it made to them. The revolt, when it comes, is not a foreign invasion. It is an internal explosion of soldiers the empire had armed and then betrayed. By 378 AD, the Visigoths have acquired weapons, gathered allies, and begun moving through the Balkan provinces. On August 9th, Emperor Valens personally leads an army to confront them near the city of Adrianople. He does not wait for reinforcements from the Western Empire. He attacks in the late afternoon heat, and by sunset, 20,000 Roman soldiers are dead on the field. Valens himself is killed, burned inside a farmhouse where he had taken shelter. The army that destroyed Rome that day was not a foreign force. It was a collection of Gothic warriors who had been trained by Roman military service, fighting with Roman-captured equipment, against an emperor whose officers had sold their children for dog meat. The immediate military defeat is catastrophic. But the deeper wound is the one the empire inflicts on itself. It has demonstrated that it cannot be trusted to honour its own agreements, that its army, when faced with enemies it created, cannot protect its own emperor. For the next 17 years, Visigoths do not vanish back across the frontier. They cannot. There is no home to return to. Instead, they remain inside Roman territory, moving through Illyricum, harassing the Balkans, negotiating, fighting, and waiting. In 395 AD, the Emperor Theodosius I formalizes their status. The Visigoths are recognized as federati, federated allies of the empire, settled on Roman land, serving under their own leaders but fighting under Roman standards. They are promised land grants in exchange for military service. The promises are made, recorded, and broken 3 separate times. By 408, Alaric is leading a force that includes not only Goths, but Romans who have deserted the empire's collapsing fiscal system, slaves who have fled the latifundia, and free farmers who have been driven off their land by tax collectors. Procopius, writing a century later, distilled the Visigoth grievance into a single sentence that should have rewritten every textbook on Roman history. They came upon the city with great fury, not because they were barbarians, but because they were starving. They had been promised land 3 times and given nothing. That line is not apologism. It is the voice of the invaders explaining themselves. And the explanation does not describe a clash of civilizations. It describes a broken contract. By the time Alaric's men reached the Salarian Gate, in 410, the city they were attacking had already collapsed from within. Rome's population, which had stood at roughly 800,000 at the empire's height, had fallen to fewer than 150,000. The streets that had once been crowded with grain carts from North Africa were quiet. Cura Annonnae, the free grain distribution that had fed 200,000 registered recipients, had ceased to function. The Emperor Honorius had moved the western capital to Ravenna in 402, behind its marshes and walls, leaving Rome without a court, without an administrative centre, without the institutional machinery that had kept the city alive for 5 centuries. A host. The senators who remained were not organisings, a defence. They were loading their private grain reserves onto wagons and fleeing through the Ostian Gate, heading for estates in the countryside, while the population they abandoned locked the gates behind them, not against the Goths, but against their own ruling class. Now, when the Visigoths breached the gate, they did not destroy a functioning empire. They entered a city that the empire had already abandoned. The sack lasted 3 days. It was brutal. Churches were respected, homes were not. But it was not a conquest. Alaric did not declare himself emperor. He did not dismantle Roman administration, took what his people had been owed, and then marched south, planning to cross to Africa, and died of illness in Calabria later that year. The Western Roman Empire did not fall on August 24, 410 AD. The emperor in Ravenna continued issuing edicts. The Eastern Court in Constantinople continued collecting taxes. But something had been demonstrated that could not be unseen. The city that had ruled the Mediterranean world for half a millennium could not defend itself, and the men who breached its gates were not foreign invaders, but Roman soldiers whose loyalty had been squandered. This is not a story about an outside force destroying a healthy civilization. It is a story about what made the body too weak to survive the blow. To understand the full depth of that weakness, you have to go back to the height of Roman power, to the year 117 AD, when the empire was administering 5 million square kilometres, 70 million people, and 8,000 kilometres of paved road. And ask how something that vast was allowed to fail. The year 117 of the Common Era, Emperor Trajan is dead. He dies in Selinus, a coastal town in Cilicia, far from Rome, far from the Senate that will soon vote him divine honours. His body is carried back to the capital in a golden urn, and the man who inherits his throne, Hadrian, will spend the next 2 decades consolidating rather than expanding. But on the day Trajan's heart stops, the empire he leaves behind is the largest it will ever be, 5 million square kilometers. Stretch that number across the surface of your mind, toast. It reaches from the rain-slicked hills of northern Britain, down through Gaul, across the spine of Italy, over the Mediterranean, into Egypt, east across Anatolia to the banks of the Euphrates. South from the Rhine frontier through the North African provinces of Mauritania and Numidia, single political entity that touches the Atlantic Ocean on one flank and the Persian Gulf on the other. There is no other state on Earth that controls so much contiguous territory. There will not be for a very long time. Inside those borders live approximately 70 million people. The estimates cluster between 65 and 75 million. The margins of uncertainty are themselves larger than the entire population of most contemporary kingdoms. But the number that matters more is the proportion. 70 million is roughly 20% of every human being alive on the planet. 1 in 5 people on Earth answers, in some final bureaucratic sense, to Rome. They speak a dozen languages, worship 100 gods, different bread, eat and bury their dead in different ground. But their taxes flow toward the same treasury. Their legal disputes can be appealed to the same emperor, and their grain surpluses travel down the same road network toward the same hungry city. That road network. 8,000 kilometers of paved surface, stone-cut and cambered for drainage, laid down across mountain passes and marshland and desert hardpan by legions who doubled as engineering corps. Romans built roads the way other empires built monuments. Not to commemorate, but to connect. Message from Rome could reach Antioch in roughly 50 days. That is not a guess. The imperial postal system, the cursus publicus, maintained relay stations at intervals of roughly 12 to 15 Roman miles. A courier would change horses, hand the dispatch to the next rider, and the message kept moving through the night. 50 days from the Forum to the Orontes, in an age when most people died within a day's walk of where they were born, information crossed the empire at a speed that would not be exceeded until the telegraph. Harder to move than information was water, and Rome moved water on a scale that remains even now difficult to absorb. The aqueducts, 11 major ones by Trajan's time, plus subsidiary branches, carried an estimated 1 million cubic meters of fresh water into the city every single day. 1 million cubic meters. That is enough to supply a modern city of several million. It flowed through stone channels graded to a precise fall of roughly 1 foot every 200. Across valleys and arcades that still stand, into the baths and fountains and private households of the capital. The engineering knowledge required to maintain that gradient over tens of kilometers. To keep the water clean and the pressure constant, institutional knowledge held by the curators aquarum, passed from senior engineer to apprentice, encoded in manuals like Frontinus's De Aqueductu. But when that knowledge burst, the water stopped, and no city in Europe would match what Rome achieved with water for 1,500 years. But infrastructure is only as stable as the social contract that funds it. And Rome had a social contract, written not in philosophy, but in grain, crowns, cura annone, public grain distribution. was not charity in any recognizable modern sense. It was a state obligation administered by a dedicated prefect, funded by taxes in kind from the provinces of Egypt and North Africa. 200,000 registered recipients in the city of Rome received a crow of wheat, monthly ration of wheat. 200,000. At the height of Trajan's reign, Rome's total population was somewhere around 1 million. The grain dole covered 20 to 30% of the entire city. The state fed its citizens directly, as a matter of policy, as a matter of expectation, as a matter of what it meant to be Roman. The ships that brought that grain, the Quat and Nona fleet, sailed from Alexandria and Carthage on a schedule that was not negotiable. The wharves at Ostia received them, the barges moved the sacks up the Tiber, and the bakers of Rome turned Egyptian wheat into Roman bread. When you ask later how this system could break, you have to understand first how deeply it was assumed. The administrative spine beneath all of this had been in place for a very long time. The Republic was traditionally dated to 509 BC. The expulsion of the last king, the foundation of the consulship, from that year to Trajan's death in 117 AD is 626 years, but the recognizably continuous bureaucratic state runs roughly 5 centuries. From the Republic's consolidation through the imperial period, 500 years of magistrates, tax rolls, provincial governors, courts, military commands, legal codes. Institutional memory that survived civil war, plague, assassination, and the occasional emperor who was certifiably insane. Paused. No other political structure in the Western Mediterranean had achieved anything close to this durability. The Egyptian dynasties were older, but they had broken and been reassembled across intermediate periods. The Persian Empire had lasted 2 centuries. Rome, by Trajan's death, been governing itself and its conquests for half a millennium without a single year, in which the central state simply ceased to exist. The machine that protected all of this was the army. Under Augustus, it had settled at roughly 300,000 soldiers. Legions of Roman citizens, auxiliaries drawn from the provinces stationed along the frontiers. It consumed a large share of the imperial budget, probably 2/3 to 3/4. But it was a professional force, paid in coin, bound by oath, disciplined by a command structure that rewarded merit and punished disloyalty with equal precision. The legions did not fight every day. Most soldiering is waiting, but their presence was the frame inside which everything else functioned. Roads were safe. Trade moved. Tax collectors could do their work. The machine was running at designed capacity. Hold that scale in your mind for a moment. 5 million square kilometers. 70 million people. 8,000 kilometers of paved road. Million cubic meters of water. 200,000 fed. 500 years of continuity. An army of 300,000. This is the civilization that fell. The question is not romantic. It is not a lament for lost greatness or a meditation on the vanity of empires. The question is forensic. What specific mechanism could unmake something this durable? What force, applied over what period, could dissolve so much institutional competence that the city capable of this would, within a few lifetimes, be unable to feed its own people or defend its own walls? The answer begins with something you would not expect. It begins with a recipe. Pliny the Elder knew the recipe by heart. In Book 14 of his Natural History, chapter 24, He writes it down without a trace of suspicion. Grape must, freshly pressed, unfermented, boiled in a leaden vessel until it reduces to 1/3 of its original volume. The result is sapper, thick, dark, sweet syrup. A great improvement to the wine, Pliny calls it. It prevents spoilage. It also cures stomach ailments. He is writing in the 1st century of the Common Era. He is one of the most learned men in Rome, author of 37 volumes of natural observation, commander of the fleet at Misenum, a man who will die trying to rescue friends from the eruption of Vesuvius. And he is recommending, without any awareness of what he is doing, one of the most efficient neurotoxin delivery systems ever incorporated into a daily diet. The chemistry is not subtle. When grape must is boiled in a lead pot for the 36 hours required to achieve the 1/3 reduction, the acetic acid in the wine reacts with the metal. The product is lead acetate. Modern toxicologists sometimes call it sugar of lead because it tastes sweet. That is the detail that should make your skin crawl. Lead acetate does not announce itself with bitterness or a metallic tang. It tastes pleasant, it encourages you to take another sip. Roman aristocrat drinking. For supper, sweetened wine was not forcing down something foul for the sake of preservation. He was reaching for the decanter because his palate told him to. Concentrations were not trace. Modern laboratory reconstruction of the Roman recipe has produced lead acetate levels up to 740 milligrams per litre. To put that number in context, the threshold for acute lead poisoning with sustained daily intake is crossed at concentrations far lower than what Pliny's cookbook casually produced. A wine sweetened with domestic supper could deliver a neurologically significant dose of lead in a single cup, and wealthy Romans drank it every day. Pliny was not the only one who thought supper harmless. It appears across Roman culinary texts. Apicius, the cookbook that survives from the late Empire, uses supper and its thicker reduction, haute de fruitum, in sauces, in meat glazes, in fruit preserves. The sweet syrup masked the taste of wine that was beginning to turn, which made it economically useful. It also, and this is the cruel joke at the centre of the whole story, actually did prevent spoilage. Lead acetate is antimicrobial. The Romans had stumbled onto an effective food preservative that was simultaneously destroying their nervous systems, and they had no way to distinguish between the two properties. But supper, not the only route into the body. The word plumbing comes from the Latin plum, plumbum, lead, and Rome used lead the way modern civilization uses plastic. It was the default material for water pipes. Wealthy neighbourhoods of the capital, the villas of Campania, the provincial townhouses of Gaul and Britain, the water that filled their fountains, kitchens and private baths, travelled the final stretch through lead pipes fitted by plumbers who worked the metal on site. Water standing in those pipes could accumulate lead concentrations exceeding 0.1 milligrams per litre, which is well above what any modern safety regulator would permit. And Roman water was not chemically innocent. The aqueducts that served the elite often drew from slightly acidic sources, mountain streams, mineral springs, water that was excellent for dissolving lead. Then there was the kitchen. Bronze pots used in wealthy households were routinely lined with lead to prevent the copper from reacting with acidic foods. Pottery was glazed with lead-based compounds that leached into hot meals. Storage vessels, mixing bowls, serving plates. The entire material culture of a Roman aristocrat's dinner table was, in retrospect, a toxicology experiment with no control group. The lead was also in the air, though the aristocrats would not have registered it as unusual. The Roman Empire, at its peak, mined between 50,000 and 80,000 tons of lead per year, a scale of extraction that would not be matched till the Industrial Revolution. Most of that lead was a byproduct of silver mining at places like Rio Tinto in Spain, where the silver that funded the imperial coinage was separated from lead ore in furnaces that vented across the landscape. The lead itself was useful. Everything from pipes to sarcophagi to the seals on official documents. The metal was cheap, malleable, everywhere. And the people who could afford to surround themselves with it were the same people running the empire. This is where the class distinction becomes critical. Not everyone in Rome was being poisoned poor. The vast majority got their water from public fountains fed by open stone channels or aqueduct mains that ran through ceramic pipes. They cooked in unglazed earthenware. They did not sweeten their wine with supper. Proud, because supper required a household kitchen with a lead pot, and the leisure time to reduce grape must over a slow fire. The lead exposure that accumulated in the bones of the Roman elite was not a universal condition of ancient life. It was a luxury good. It concentrated precisely in the senatorial class, the equestrian order, provincial governors and legion commanders, and imperial bureaucrats, who made the decisions that determined whether the empire would adapt to crisis or fracture under it. In 1983, two researchers working independently, S.C. Gilfillan and J.O. Nriagu, published papers arguing that this class-specific lead poisoning had played a significant role in the cognitive and reproductive decline of Roman ruling elite. Gilfillan framed it as the hidden variable in Rome's long deterioration. Nriagu, more cautiously, called it a class-specific neurotoxin, a phrase that has the virtue of precision. The men who commanded armies and set tax policy and negotiated with foreign powers were operating with measurable neurological impairment, reduced impulse control, shortened time horizons, a diminished capacity to hold long chains of consequence in their heads. The decisions that required the most foresight were being made by the people equipped to make them. The logic of the hypothesis has a terrible elegance. The same metal that carried water to the baths and sweetened the wine and preserved the sauce was also, molecule by molecule, rewiring the brains of the men who believed the empire was permanent. They could not see it. They could not taste it. They consumed it with every meal and called it refinement. But any honest historian must ask the next question. The logic is compelling, chemistry is sound, but does the physical evidence, the bones, the teeth, the measurable residue of lived lives, actually support the theory? In 1980, 3 years before Gilfillan and Nriagu published, archaeologists working in the ruins of Herculaneum found a man who had been dead for 19 centuries. His skeleton would arrive in a laboratory in Illinois 33 years later. And what the scientists found in his rib bone would give the lead hypothesis a body. Philippe de Charette had been digging for 3 weeks when they found the boat shed. It was 1980. The Herculaneum site, buried under 25 meters of volcanic debris since AD 79, was yielding its dead in ways archaeologists had not anticipated. Near the ancient shoreline, inside a stone boathouse that would have faced the sea before the beach was buried, skeleton lay curled in the posture of a man who knew he was not going to reach the water. The arms were half raised, palms forward, elbows bent. Not fighting exactly, but bracing. Surrender made bone. The first thing that told Charette this was not a local fisherman was the wool, fibres of a fine woven tunic. The kind senators wore clung to the ribs and shoulders. The man had been approximately 50 years old. He had died inside a structure that was never meant to be a tomb. And the ash and the steam and the searing heat that killed him had, in the same instant, sealed his skeleton inside a near-perfect anaerobic capsule. No oxygen, no groundwater percolation, no microbial decay of the sort that slowly leaches trace elements out of bone. For 19 centuries, his chemistry, not just his shape, sat waiting. 2013, a rib fragment from that skeleton was flown to the University of Illinois. Dr. Bruce Zafonte, toxicologist, who had spent years reconstructing lead burdens in ancient populations, placed the bone section under a diamond saw. The sample was dissolved in ultra-pure nitric acid and run through an inductively coupled plasma mass spectrometer, POST. The instrument was calibrated to detect metal concentrations at the parts per billion level. When the output screen flickered and stabilized, Zafonte did something he rarely did. He looked at the number, walked away from his desk, and then circled back to verify the calibration log. The reading was 112 micrograms of lead per gram of bone. In modern clinical terms, blood lead level of 10 micrograms per deciliter is the threshold at which health authorities mandate intervention. Children with levels that high are flagged for immediate medical follow-up. Bone lead concentration tracks cumulative exposure, 112 micrograms per gram in rib bone, 8 times the modern acceptable reference, placed this man in a category that modern medicine reserves for severe chronic industrial toxicity. It was the highest lead concentration ever recorded in a Roman skeleton at that time. Zafonte's team sectioned a tooth. Under polarized light, the dentine revealed a pattern of alternating opaque and translucent bands, growth rings in a tree. Lead deposits laid down during childhood enamel formation showed the same elevated signature. This was not a man who had been exposed to lead in his final years alone from a single bad batch of sapa, or a house plumbed with poor alloys. The dental histology documented a loading that began before his permanent teeth had finished. Erupting, he had been absorbing the metal every day of his life. Every meal, every cup of sweetened wine, draught of water that had passed through the lead pipes of a perfectly Roman kitchen. The skeleton belonged to the ruling class. What that meant, translated into the bloodstream, was estimated to be between 150 and 200 micrograms of lead per deciliter, 15 to 20 times the level known to impair executive function. The cognitive arithmetic that follows is stark and not speculative. Prospective epidemiological studies, conducted across multiple countries and decades, established that for every 30 micrograms per deciliter increase in childhood blood lead, IQ drops by approximately 5 to 10 points. A man operating with the of 150 to 200 micrograms per deciliter in the brain's vascular bath is not merely less sharp than he might been. His capacity to sustain a long arc of reasoning, to weigh distant consequences, to override the impulse of the moment in favour of strategic restraint. These are neurologically inhibited. Frontal lobe functions that govern planning and inhibition are being chemically disassembled. The behaviour that results maps onto the historical record with unsettling fidelity. Increased aggression, poor impulse control, preference for immediate gratification over systemic maintenance, a shrinking time horizon. From the 2nd century onward, the imperial biographies even allowing for the exaggerations of hostile sources, read like a clinical catalogue of exactly those traits. Emperors who killed on a whim, senators who stripped public funds for private luxury while the frontiers were under pressure, generals who sought the purple rather than reinforcing the Rhine. The men running Rome were literally less capable of complex, future-oriented thinking than the administrators who had built the institutions they were now mismanaging. Dr. Zafonte, when he presented the findings, did not package the data in careful, conditional language. He stood next to an image of the rib bone, the tooth, the spectral peaks from the spectrometer, and he said it plainly. This is the skeleton of a man who was poisoned every day of his life. The effect on his leadership class would have been a gradual, systematic reduction in the ability to plan, to negotiate, to anticipate consequences. In other words, it made the decision-makers stupid, and a stupid ruling class does not survive a crisis. There was silence in the room, particular silence that falls when a hypothesis that previously existed as chemicals on paper and pages in journals acquires a name, a face, a set of raised arms, and a boat shed that still smelled faintly of ancient salt. Vinets. The man from the boathouse had not been a general or a consul, far as anyone could tell. He had been a wealthy Roman of the senatorial order, the class from which generals and consuls were drawn. His bones are now a numbered specimen in an archive. But the toxic damage inscribed in his skeleton was not his alone. It was replicated in varying concentrations across the elite burials of Herculaneum, of Roman Britain, of the villas in Gaul. The ruling class was neurologically compromised, not in isolated cases, but systematically, intergenerationally, post, and without any awareness of its own decline. And if that was what the lead had done to the men who made the decisions, the next question was not whether the decisions were bad. The next question was what it felt like to live through the consequences of those bad decisions. In a household where the supper was still being poured, and someone at the table already knew something was wrong. The Palatine Hill, sometime in the late 1st century. A dinner party in the house of a man whose name does not survive, but whose rank does, senatorial, old money, the kind that had filled the Senate House since before Augustus was a thought. The couches are arranged in the Greek style. The lamps are bronze. Food is elaborate to the point of performance, which is the point. And the slave who moves between the couches with a dark, sweet-smelling decanter is carrying something that no one in the room understands. The decanter holds sapa, grape must, boiled in a lead pot over a slow fire for 2 days, until a third of the original volume remains. The result is viscous, intensely sweet, deliberately so. Roman cooks prized sapa as a preservative, a flavour enhancer, a corrective for sour wine. They added it to sauces. They mixed it into drinking wine. They gave it to children as a treat. The kitchen that produced this particular decanter had a dedicated lead, cauldron, the standard equipment in any household of means. No one had ever suggested there was anything wrong with that. Senator's wife accepts a cup. She is pregnant, and her previous pregnancy had ended in a birth so quiet that the household does not speak of it. The child was stillborn. She does not connect these facts. She cannot. The connection between lead cookware and reproductive catastrophe, between the sweet syrup on her tongue and the death of the child, does not exist in the Roman medical imagination. Galen will write thousands of pages of medical text without identifying it. Celsus will compile his encyclopedia in total ignorance. The woman drinks the wine. She tastes sweetness. She tastes nothing else. A man at the far couch places his hand over his own cup. He is Greek, physician attached to the household, and he is not drinking. He has read Nicander of Colophon, 2nd century BC poet, who catalogued poisons and their antidotes in hexameter verse. Nicander had described something he called the leaden grip, the colic, the pallor, the paralysis that followed exposure to white lead, prot. The Greek physician knows that boiling acidic liquids in lead vessels produces this compound. He knows that the slaves in the mines, the ones who handle the raw metal, sicken and die young. He knows enough to be afraid. He also knows enough to say nothing. Physician at a senator's table, does not contradict the household's practices in public. He does not refuse the host's wine in a manner that can be seen. He places his hand gently, unobtrusively, over the rim of the cup. Gesture is not recorded anywhere except in the logic of the situation. The silence is the evidence. Pliny the Elder is the man who supplies the text. He wrote 37 volumes of natural history, botany, zoology, mineralogy, medicine, agriculture, the most comprehensive compendium of human knowledge produced in the ancient world. He died chasing the eruption of Vesuvius, victim of his own curiosity. And in Book 14, Chapter 24, he describes exactly this syrup, without the faintest suspicion that it might be harmful. Muster supper, he writes, boiled down in leaden vessels to 1/3 of its volume. It is a great improvement to the wine. It prevents spoilage. It also cures stomach ailments. He recommends it sincerely. He has probably consumed it himself for decades. The man who documented the natural world with obsessive precision could not see the poison in his own kitchen. His text is the alibi and the evidence simultaneously. The lead was not confined to the decanter. Excavations of elite female skeletons at Herculaneum and across Roman Britain have turned up bone lead concentrations that match or exceed the men. One Herculaneum woman, buried with jewellery and cosmetic implements of the kind, available only to the wealthy, showed dental lead banding identical to the senator in the boat shed. Childhood exposure. Lifelong accumulation. The lead was in the food and the drink. Not merely in the pipes that brought water to the house, which the poor did not have, but in the very substances that made a Roman table. Roman. The vessels, the glazes, the syrup, the preservative. A wife, drinking wine alongside her husband, was absorbing the same poison, child given a spoonful of supper. As a sweetener was starting the same accumulation from the moment solid food replaced milk. Fertility arithmetic follows the toxicology. Chronic lead exposure at the blood levels documented in the Roman elite is spermicidal. It damages sperm motility and morphology directly. It is abortifacient. It crosses the placental barrier and concentrates in foetal tissue, triggering spontaneous termination at rates the Romans themselves recorded dimly in numbers of lamented stillbirths and smaller families. From the 1st to the 3rd centuries, senatorial birth rates fell to levels below replacement. The aristocratic clans that had provided consuls, generals, provincial governors, for 500 years were producing fewer children than required to sustain themselves. The demographic record does not require lead as the exclusive mechanism. Some elite families practiced deliberate child limitation to prevent the fragmentation of estates. But the two explanations sit uncomfortably together, because a class that is both rationally limiting its reproduction and chemically degrading its fertility is a class that is failing itself on every vector available. The woman on the Palatine couch, drinking her sweetened wine, had no way to know that her stillborn child had been killed by her kitchen ware. Her husband had read Pliny and trusted him. Greek physician who knew better could not speak. And the decanter kept passing. The syrup kept being poured, bones accumulating the metal that would kept accumulating the metal show up 19 centuries later under a diamond saw in Illinois. What this means, stripped of metaphor, is that the class responsible for governing an empire of 70 million people was not only neurologically impaired in the present, but demographically failing into the future. The men who made the decisions were less capable of making them. The number of men available to assume those responsibilities was shrinking. And the children who might have replaced them were being lost in the womb, born to mothers whose own lead burden had been rising since childhood. The Romans documented everything. They wrote the recipes, catalogued the remedies. They preserved the warning signs in texts that were available to anyone who could read them. And they still could not assemble the pieces into a picture they could recognize. A civilization drinking poison while describing the cure, recording its own symptoms in detail, and filing them under the heading of improvement. The evidence lands with quiet weight, but the next step demands honest accounting of what the data can actually sustain. The first problem is the sample. Nearly all Roman skeletal lead measurements come from wealthy urban burials. Herculaneum, Rome itself, a handful of sites in Roman Britain and Gaul, where the preserved remains belong overwhelmingly to the class that could afford lead water pipes, lead cooking vessels, lead-sweetened wine. The urban poor, the rural peasantry, the millions of farmers who worked the land and never saw a lead-lined pot. They are almost entirely absent from the record. Bones were not preserved in volcanic ash. Their graves were simpler, shallower, more vulnerable to time and plough and acid soil. We have, in effect, tested the exact population the lead hypothesis would predict to be most affected, and we have almost no control group. Worldwide, the total number of Roman skeletons subjected to lead, isotope, or concentration analysis remains vanishingly small. Perhaps a few hundred individuals, mostly from a few elite burial contexts. That is the entirety of the physical dataset on which the entire lead hypothesis rests. A single catastrophic event, the 79 AD eruption of Vesuvius, handed us the best preserved Roman bones ever found, but it handed us only a few dozen individuals, all of them caught in the ash of a single day in a single town, extrapolating from Herculaneum to every senator, in every province across 3 centuries, is an act of inference, not of proof. Consider the public fountains. The vast majority of Rome's population did not have household plumbing. They carried water from public basins fed by aqueduct channels, open stone conduits, not lead pipes. Water spent minimal time in contact with lead between the aqueduct intake and the fountain spout. Modern modellings suggests their exposure was a fraction of what an aristocrat received from the pipes that ran directly to a private kitchen. But that word is doing heavy work, because the peasant skeletons are not there to prove it. What? We do not know what the baseline lead burden of a rural farm labourer in Gaul was. We do not know whether the elite were 15 times more poisoned, or merely 3 times. The comparison point that would give the hypothesis its statistical power has rotted into European soil. Another variable further complicates the pipe argument. In many Roman water systems, hard water deposited a thick layer of calcium carbonate inside the pipes, a scale that could, in theory, shielded the flowing water from the lead beneath. Whether this scale formed, how thick it was, how often it was cleaned or scraped, varied from city to city and from decade to decade. The measured lead levels in pipe-fed water samples that archaeologists have excavated are not uniform. Some are elevated, some are lower than expected. The pipes were not a constant poison. They were an intermittent one. Their toxicity, modulated by water chemistry, maintenance, and the length of the pipe run, the skeleton in the boat shed, does not tell you whether his lead came from the pipes or the sapper, or both, in what proportion, or at what stage of his life. There is a second evidentiary gap, and it is larger than the first. Sapper appears in elite Roman cookbooks. Apicius includes it in sauces and wine recipes. Pliny praises it. Columella describes its production, but none of these texts record the frequency of consumption. We do not know whether a senator drank supper-sweetened wine daily, weekly, only at banquets. We do not know whether the cookbooks represent actual practice across the entire aristocracy or the aspirational ideal of a few gourmands. The recipe for sapper itself requires boiling grape, mussed for 36 hours in a lead pot, a significant investment of fuel, and supervised labour. Was it a luxury condiment used sparingly, or a household staple? The texts do not say, assuming daily universal intake among all aristocrats for 3 centuries. The assumption that makes the toxicological arithmetic so devastating extrapolates well beyond what the written sources can sustain. The lead was certainly present. The dose is uncertain. And in toxicology, dose is everything. R.P. Duncan Jones raised a third problem, and it is the one most scholars in this debate are least comfortable dismissing. Senatorial fertility declined sharply from the 1st to the 3rd centuries. That is not in dispute. The lead hypothesis offers one explanation: chemical degradation of sperm, interference with implantation, foetal loss. Duncan Jones offered another, pointed out that the Roman aristocracy had powerful economic reasons to limit reproduction. Estate fragmentation was the great fear of every landowning family. Every surviving child represented a division of property that could cross 3 or 4 generations, reduce a vast latifundium to a scatter of economically unviable parcels. The rational response was to produce only as many children necessary to maintain the line. Deliberate child limitation through exposure to the control, abstinence, or the quiet disposal of unwanted infants was a documented feature of elite Roman demography. The fertility decline could be a strategy, not a symptom. The 2 explanations are not mutually exclusive, but they pull the evidence in different directions. A class that is rationally limiting its reproduction is making a choice. A class that is chemically incapable of reproducing is suffering a pathology. The bones cannot distinguish between these. A woman with elevated lead levels who bore only one child could have been poisoned, or she could have been exercising demographic prudence, or both. Methodological ceiling sits precisely here. Without a statistically representative sample that crosses class boundaries and covers the full span, centuries from the late Republic to the late Empire, the lead hypothesis cannot graduate from plausible contributor to primary cause, and that sample is irretrievable. It is buried under modern cities. It was cremated on pyres that left no trace, was dissolved in shallow graves before anyone thought to look for it. J.H.F. Hughes, in a careful 2014 review, called Roman lead exposure a class-specific neurotoxin. That framing is more defensible than any claim that lead caused the fall of Rome, shifts the hypothesis from deterministic to contributory. It allows the evidence to be real without demanding that it explain everything. It acknowledges the skeletal data without overreading it. The scientific consensus in 1924 sits cautiously in that space. Lead exposure among Roman elites was real, was documented at levels that cause measurable harm, and was consequential. It is a factor in the cognitive and reproductive decline of the ruling class. It is not the sole engine of collapse. The empire was not killed by its plumbing, but a decision-making class that was incrementally less capable of long-term planning, more aggressive, more impulsive, and demographically shrinking. That class was less equipped to manage the fiscal and military crises that were already gathering. The specific people whose judgment was dulled, whose fertility was compromised, time horizons were shortened by the sweet syrup in their wine. Those were the people responsible for tax policy, military command, the allocation of grain, the maintenance of roads. The fiscal decisions that determined whether the empire stood or collapsed were made by the same brains that were accumulating lead from childhood. The bodies in the ground are the warning. The ledgers that would show the consequence come next. Tivoli, 359 AD. The man's name is Aurelius Simplicius, and he holds a piece of papyrus that has just ended his life as he knew it. Simplicius is a decurion, a local government official in a provincial town 20 miles east of Rome. The position sounds modest. It was anything but. Under Roman law, a decurion was personally and financially liable for the full tax assessment of his district if his neighbours could not pay. If a harvest failed, if an epidemic swept through the labour force, farmer simply vanished into the hills. The decurion made up the difference from his own estate. The state did not accept excuses. The state did not adjust quotas for bad years. The state sent demand letters, and someone had to answer them. The letter in Simplicius's hand is for a neighbour's unpaid arrears. A man whose farm failed 2 seasons running host. The debt is not large by senatorial standards, but it is larger than Simplicius can cover without selling his own land. Land that is already going fallow. Land that he can see from his window. The fields his father worked, his grandfather cleared, now choked with weeds because the labour that should be tending them is being pulled toward obligations that have nothing to do with farming. He watches his own acreage die while he serves as an unpaid tax collector for an empire that has not defended this district in living memory. The mechanism that put him in this position has a name: the latifundia system. For 2 centuries, wealthy landowners had been absorbing the small farms around Tivoli. A freeholder hits a bad harvest and cannot pay his taxes. The senator down the road, the one with the private irrigation and the armed estate guards, offers to purchase the land at a fraction of its value. Freeholder sells because the alternative is debt, bondage, or flight. The senator adds the parcel to his holdings. And here is the crucial fiscal detail. Once absorbed it into a large estate, that land often dropped off the standard tax rolls. Great magnates had the legal resources, the administrative staff, and the outright political power to ensure their properties were assessed at rates that bore no relationship to their actual value. The tax burden did not vanish. It was redistributed onto whoever remained on the registers, men like Simplicius. So the demand letter in his hand is not a random administrative error. It is the endpoint of a structural logic. The wealthy expanded their holdings and withdrew their contribution. The shrinking pool of free taxpayers, decurions, smallholders, the remaining independent farmers, were left carrying a burden designed for a population twice their size. The mathematics were fatal. Simplicius does something that 100 years earlier would have been unthinkable. He burns the letter. His wife Flavia has already begun packing. Not furniture, not the bronze cookware that was her dowry. She packs the household gods, the small wooden figurines of the Lares and Penatis, spirits of the family, and the storeroom that had protected this household for three generations. She wraps them in linen and places them in a chest. She knows what the law says about men who abandon their posts. Everyone in this district knows Theodosian Code, Law 12.1.173, issued in 379 AD, 20 years after Simplicius fled, describes the penalty with the flat, bureaucratic specificity of a state that has lost all patience. Decurions who abandon their duties will be brought back in chains. Their bodies will be tortured. Their property will be confiscated. The law does not distinguish between a decurion who fled to avoid crushing debt, one who fled to embezzle true treasury funds. The punishment is the same because the state no longer had the luxury of nuance. Tax collection system was collapsing, and the response was not reform. It was threat. But threats require enforcement. Enforcement requires a functioning apparatus. By 359, the apparatus in the western provinces was already fragmenting. The men who were supposed to bring Simplicius back in chains were themselves underpaid or unpaid, or had accepted private employment with the very senators whose estates the law was supposed to reach. The Theodosian Code thunders from the page, but the page is not a prison. Simplicius and Flavia walk away from their estate before anyone arrives to stop them. Lactantius, writing in the early 4th century, described tax assessors as more terrible than war itself. That phrase is worth sitting with. An empire that had survived Hannibal, that had conquered Carthage and Gaul, and half of Britain, had produced a tax system that its own citizens described in the language of enemy invasion. Lactantius was not speaking about barbarians at the gate. He was describing Roman officials collecting Roman taxes from Roman farmers, and he reached for the vocabulary of war crimes, because no gentler vocabulary fit what he had witnessed. What was driving this desperation at the imperial level? The arithmetic is straightforward and devastating. The Roman army consumed 70 to 80% of the imperial budget by the year 200 AD. The same military that had once numbered around 300,000 soldiers under Augustus had swollen to roughly 400,000 necessary expansion to defend frontiers that stretched from the Euphrates to the North Sea. But every additional legionary required pay, equipment, rations, and the vast logistical tail that sustained a professional army across half a continent. The state was paying for that army by destroying its own currency. The silver denarius, the somma, the coin that had been the backbone of Roman commerce for centuries, had been systematically debased. Under Augustus, a denarius was roughly 95% silver. By the year 260 AD, it was 5%. The government was minting coins with a thin silver wash over a base metal core, declaring them legal tender at the old value, and using them to pay to immediately discovered that merchants would not accept the coins at face value. Wheat prices in Egypt tell the story in numbers no one can dismiss. Between the year 150 AD and the year 300 AD, price of wheat rose 500-fold. Not doubled, not tripled, 500 times. Currency collapse of that magnitude does not merely inconvenience the wealthy, it destroys the economic logic by which farmers plant crops for next year's market, by which merchants arrange shipments, by which soldiers just trust that their pay will feed their families. The army that was supposed to protect the tax base was consuming the tax base to fund itself, and the coin it was paid in was losing purchasing power faster than the treasury could debase it further. Simplicius could not have articulated this in macroeconomic terms. He did not need to. He could see the results in the fallow fields, the empty neighbour's farm, the demand letter that no honest decurion could possibly satisfy. He knew the system was broken because the system was breaking him. Personally, with a piece of papyrus in his hand, Kraus, what he did, by burning that letter and walking into the hills with his wife and his household gods, was not unique to Tivoli. It was happening across Gaul, across Spain, across every western province where the arithmetic of tax liability had separated from the reality of agricultural production. The decurions fled, or they sold their land to the latifundia owners and became tenants on what they had once owned. The registers lost names. The treasury lost revenue. And the hole in the imperial budget grew wider, with every man who made the same calculation Clesius made, that the state he was supposed to serve was more dangerous to him than the consequences of abandoning it. The letter burned. The man vanished from the records. But the structural logic he fled from was about to find its purest expression in someone who did not flee at all, someone who stayed and grew rich. And when the moment came to answer for what he owed, the people he had abandoned in the eye and kept walking. The year is 408 AD. The gate is the Ostian Gate of Rome, the southern entrance, through which grain shipments from the port had once poured into the city, day after day. Year after year, for centuries, traffic has stopped. What moves through the gate now is not supply arriving, but supply leaving. Senator Rufius Volusianus rides at the head of a wagon train. He controls grain reserves drawn from 250 private estates scattered across Italy, Sicily, and North Africa, accumulated by his family over generations of strategic marriage, foreclosure, the quiet absorption of smaller farms whose owners could not pay what the state demanded from them. and would not enforce against the men who could. The wagons are heavy, loaded with amphorae of olive oil, sacks of wheat, sealed containers of wine, the equivalent of a private food supply for a city of several thousand people being pulled out of Rome, while Rome itself is preparing for a siege. Crowd at the gate has gathered over the previous hours. Word had spread that the senators were leaving, and the senators were taking the food with them. Women, children, freedmen, labourers. The people who did not own country villas or fortified estates. People whose survival depended on what remained in the city's granaries. They watch the wagons creak past, and they understand exactly what they are watching. A common woman steps forward. Her name does not survive in any account. Zosimus, writing his new history, roughly a century later, records only what she shouted as Volusianus passed, "Where will we eat?" The senator does not stop, he does not turn, he does not answer her. Zosimus, in Book 5, Chapter 40, Section 2, preserves the logic of the men in those wagons with a clarity that requires no commentary. The aristocrats looked at the empty granaries and said, "Let them starve so long as we live." Let that sentence sit where it lands. It is not a line invented by a hostile chronicler to blacken a name. It is the recorded position of the Roman senatorial class in the year before the Visigoths entered the city. A position voiced not in a moment of panic, but in the cold, logistical calculation of men who had weighed their obligations against their interests and made their choice. The city they were abandoning had already collapsed in ways that numbers make plain. At the height of the empire, proud, Rome held approximately 800,000 people, a population density that required the constant orchestrated movement of grain from Egypt, North Africa, and Sicily, managed by a dedicated imperial bureaucracy, the Cura Annonae, distributed free grain to 200,000 registered recipients. By 408, the city's population had shrunk to fewer than 150,000. The contraction was not caused by the approaching Goths. It was the result of decades during which the supply chains that made a city of 800,000 possible had quietly, systematically come apart. The emperor was no longer in Rome. The Western court had been moved to Ravenna in 402 AD. A city surrounded by marshes, easier to defend, harder to besiege, and far from the increasingly unmanageable politics of the old capital. The administrative talent that had once coordinated the grain shipments, maintained the port facilities at Ostia, and managed the distribution schedules had followed the court. Rome was left with the symbolic weight of its history, and none of the operational infrastructure that had once turned that weight into daily bread. The Cura Annonae, the grain dole that had been the most visible expression of the Roman state's compact with its citizens, was no longer functioning, without tax revenue flowing into the Western treasury. The state could not purchase Egyptian grain. The shipments from North Africa, already threatened by the Vandal presence in the Western Mediterranean, slowed, and then stopped. Free grain that had fed 200,000 registered recipients simply ceased to exist as a state obligation, replaced by nothing except the private charity of individual bishops and the dwindling reserves of whatever magnates had not yet removed their supplies from the city. The people at the Ostian Gate understood this with an immediacy that no economic historian needs to reconstruct. They saw the wagons. They saw the wagons. They saw the men who owned the wagons, and they made a decision that tells you more about the final years of the Western Empire than any treatise on monetary policy or military recruitment. They locked the gates. Not to keep the Goths out, to keep the senators in, Zosimus records the moment. The citizens feared their own ruling class more than they feared the army camped beyond the walls. They barricaded the Ostian Gate and refused to let the wagons pass until the food was distributed. The confrontation did not last long. Men with 250 estates have resources that street crowds do not. The gates were forced, or the senators found another exit. The sources are fragmentary. What matters is the act itself, population, that had once looked to its aristocracy for protection, for civic leadership, for the personification of Roman order, now saw those same figures as the primary threat to their survival. The senators, for their part, long since ceased to depend on the state for their security. By 400 AD, the wealthiest landowners funded their own armed retinues. They hired Germanic mercenaries directly. The same fighting men the imperial army could no longer afford to recruit, and paid them out of private, state revenues to guard their properties, ours, escort their grain shipments, and enforce their interests against whoever happened to hold the nearest official title. The state could not provide security post, so the wealthy purchased security for themselves, privately, and treated the taxes that might have funded a public army as an expense they no longer needed to bear. The wagons rolled out of Rome. Volusianus and his colleagues dispersed to their fortified country estates, where the food they had removed would sustain their households through the coming siege. The woman who asked the question, "Where will we eat?" received no answer from the man she asked. She would find her answer in the months that followed, in a city without functioning grain shipments, without an emperor, without an army, waiting for the arrival of an army that its own ruling class had once commanded. 2 years later, Alaric's men were inside the walls. They would strip Rome's lead water pipes from the ground and melt them down to make sling bullets stamped with a single word: public, the Republic. The metal that had carried water to senators' kitchens, the same compound that had accumulated in their bones. Across a lifetime of sweetened wine, lead-lined pots would be repurposed into the ammunition that struck the basilicas and temples of the capital. The poison completed its circuit, and the empire hollowed out from within. Long before the first Goth touched the first stone, would be assigned a simple cause that no one wanted to examine too closely: barbarians at the gate. The man wakes before the light. There is no name for him in any register that survives. The tax rolls that listed his holdings, the census that counted his family, the boundary stones that marked his land. All of it would be gone within a generation, absorbed into an estate whose owner's name would appear on no imperial tax assessment at all. But on this morning, in this year, 380 AD, in the Gallic countryside north of the declining Roman city of Arelate, he is still a free farmer, and he is still the owner of the land he is about to walk. He dresses in the dark. The air is cold, the kind of damp cold that settles into the bones of a house with stone walls and a thatched roof, and no hypocaust to warm it. His wife stirs but does not rise. The children sleep in a pile of wool blankets near the hearth, where the embers from last night's fire still hold a faint orange glow. He steps outside the boundary stones. He has been checking them every morning for 2 weeks. The farm is small, perhaps 20 ujura. Ruly 13 acres, enough to grow wheat and barley, and a small plot of vegetables, enough to keep a few sheep and a pair of oxen. His grandfather cleared this land when the empire was still expanding, and land grants were a way of binding veterans to the frontier. His father inherited it whole and passed it to him whole, and he had assumed, in the unthinking way that men assume such things, that he would pass it to his sons whole in turn. The eastern boundary stone sits at the edge of the ploughed field where his land meets the uncultivated scrub that separates him from the estate to the east. That estate has been growing. Not by purchase. Nobody purchases land from a free farmer who will not sell. It grows by a slower, more patient mechanism. A boundary stone moves a few feet one season. A grazing right is contested and resolved in favour of the larger party. Water source is diverted. A magistrate, who owes his position to the estate's owner, rules on a dispute in ways that a small farmer with no patron, no means to appeal. He reaches the stone, kneels. It has been moved again. 3 feet further into his field than it was yesterday. The earth around the base is freshly turned. Though whoever moved it tried to pack the soil down, he can see the impressions of a wooden lever and the deeper prints of several men's feet. They came at night while he slept, while his dogs barked at shadows they must have known better than to chase. He does not shout. He does not run to the provincial governor's office in Arelate, because the provincial governor dines with the owner of the estate to the east, and done so for years. The law, in theory, protects freeholders against the encroachment of larger neighbours. In practice, the law requires a plaintiff with the resources to bring a suit, the literacy to file a petition, and the political connections to ensure that the petition is heard by someone who is not already in debt to the opposing party. He has none of these things. He walks back to his house. The sun is beginning to rise. He will plough the field today, or as much of it as still belongs to him. And he will not mention the stone to his wife until she asks why he is planting fewer rows than last season. There is another pressure, heavier than any stone, the capitatio. Diocletian's tax reforms of 293 AD had been designed in principle to rationalise an imperial revenue system that the chaos of the 3rd century had nearly destroyed. The iagatio capitatio combined a land assessment. The iagatio, based on the quality and productivity of the holding, with a head count. The capitatio, flat per person levy, assessed on every rural inhabitant regardless of yield. The system required accurate census registers, regularly updated, maintained by local officials, called decurions, who were themselves personally liable for any shortfall in their district's collection. Farmer. A farmer does not understand the administrative theory behind the tax that is crushing him. He understands that the amount demanded at the end of each harvest season has not decreased even as his yields have fallen. 2 bad harvests in a row. The first from a drought that withered the wheat before it headed, the second from a spring frost that killed the barley shoots in the ground, have left his grain stores too thin to meet the assessment and still feed family through the winter. He has sold one of the oxen. He has sold the sheep. He has borrowed against next year's crop from a moneylender in the town at interest rates that make it unlikely he will ever the debt. The capitatio does not forgive bad years. The state that demands it is fighting wars on the Rhine and the Danube, paying an army that consumes most of its budget in debased silver coinage that buys less grain every season. The state cannot afford mercy. There is no single morning when the farmer decides to surrender his land. The process takes months, and each step is small enough to feel like a temporary accommodation rather than a permanent loss. First, he accepts a loan from the estate to the east, secured against his field. Then he agrees to work a portion of the estate's land in lieu of interest, which takes him away from his own planting and harvesting at the critical times. Then the head tax falls due again, and the loan has not been repaid, and the estate's steward offers a solution that is not presented as a threat, because it does not need to be. The farmer will transfer title of his land to the estate. In exchange, he and his family will remain on the land as coloni, bound tenants, legally tied to the property, permitted to work a portion of it for their own subsistence. In return for a fixed share of the harvest, delivered to the estate's granary, he will no longer own the soil he tills. He will no longer appear on the imperial tax rolls as an independent household. He will no longer be a free citizen in the legal sense that had defined Roman identity for 500 years. One season he works his own land as a free man. The next season he works the same land as a tenant, owing his labour and his grain to a man whose name he does not know, a senator who lives in a villa near Massilia and has never set foot on this particular field and never will. There is another loss quieter than the loss of property and harder to quantify in a tax register. Free farmer who owns land is eligible for military service. Not that he wants to be drafted. The Roman army of the 4th century is a brutal institution, and the farmers of Gaul have learned to dread the recruiting officers who sweep through the countryside during levy seasons. But eligibility means something beyond the obligation itself. It means that he belongs to the Roman project. He is a citizen in a world where citizenship still carries a residual charge of dignity and inclusion, even after Caracalla extended it universally in 212 AD and diluted its exclusivity. He has a stake in the empire's survival. His sons might serve in the legions, and his grandsons might rise to the decurionate, and the chain of connection between the man who ploughs the soil and the state that protects it remains unbroken. Bound tenant on a private estate is none of those things. He is a labourer. His sons are labourers. His grandsons will be labourers. The estate's owner pays a tax on the land, or, increasingly, finds ways not to pay it, and the colonist disappears from the census as a political entity. He is no longer a citizen soldier. He is a pair of hands. Multiply this farmer by thousands. Census registers that survive from 4th century Gaul and Spain. Fragmentary, incomplete, consistent in their direction, show the same process unfolding across entire provinces. The number of free rural taxpayers shrinks year by year. Past, the number of bound tenants on private estates grows. The latifundia expand, not because their owners are more efficient farmers, but because they are more effective at absorbing the land of men who cannot pay the tax that the state demands from them, and will not enforce against the men who can. Tax burden does not shrink when the farmer vanishes from the rolls. It redistributes. The decurion, who must still meet his district's target, now assesses the remaining freeholders at higher rates to cover the shortfall, pushes more of them to insolvency, which pushes more of them into the arms of the estate owners who are waiting to absorb their land, which shrinks the tax base again, which requires higher rates on those who remain. The cycle feeds itself. The state's revenue collapses, not because the economy has stopped producing, but because the producers have been removed from the tax rolls one boundary stone at a time, and no one with the power to stop it has any reason to try. August 24, 410 AD. The Salarian Gate gives way. Men who pour through it are not Huns. They are not some unknowable force from the steppe. They are Visigoths, and they have been living inside Roman borders for 34 years. Since the Emperor Valens allowed them across the Danube in 376, fleeing the very Huns, Rome would later pay them to fight. Their leader, Alaric, holds Roman military rank. He has commanded Roman troops. The swords his men carry were forged in Roman armories. The tactics they used to take the city were learned in Roman training camps. What is breaching Rome is not an invasion. It is a mutiny. And within hours of entering the city, the Visigoths begin stripping the infrastructure, tear the lead water pipes from the walls. Rome's aqueducts had once delivered 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day, an engineering achievement unmatched in Europe for 15 centuries. The pipes that distributed that water through the city's elite districts were made of the same metal that had been quietly accumulating in aristocratic bone marrow for generations past. Now those pipes are being wrenched from their mountings and carried to makeshift forges in the streets. Visigoths melt Rome's plumbing into ammunition. The sling bullets recovered from the 410 sack. Archaeologists have found them in the strata of destruction, bear a Latin stamp, not a Gothic rune, not a tribal symbol, a Latin word, res publica, the Republic. Rome's own lead, the same compound that Pliny recommended as a wine sweetener, the same smell that concentrated in the rib bone of the Herculaneum senator, to 8 times the modern safety limit, being poured into moulds and cooled into projectiles and fired back at the city, whose ruling class poisoned itself with it for 300 years. Sallustius, a grain distributor stationed at the Salarian Gate, watches this happen. He is not a soldier. His job for years had been logistics, tracking shipments from North Africa, filing supply records for the troops stationed in the city. Some of the men he now sees firing lead bullets at the Basilica of St. Paul are men whose supply forms he would have processed. He would have filed their grain requisitions. He would have known their units, their commanders, their deployment rotations. They are not strangers. They are Roman soldiers who stopped being paid by a Roman state that had stopped collecting taxes from the Roman aristocrats, who had stopped believing the state was worth funding. Procopius, writing a century later, would record the grievance that Alaric's men carried into Rome. They had been promised land 3 times. 3 separate Roman emperors had made commitments: settlement, rights, agricultural grants, basic bargain that federati accepted in exchange for military service. 3 times the promises were broken. The grain shipments that were supposed to sustain them were sold to them at extortionate prices by corrupt officials, or replaced with dog meat, simply never delivered. The Visigoths did not attack Rome because they were barbarians. They attacked because they were starving, and because The empire that had asked for their loyalty had demonstrated, repeatedly and systematically, that it felt no reciprocal obligation. Population that watches the sack unfold has no one coming to save them. The Western court had moved to Ravenna in 402 AD. 8 years earlier, Honorius, the Western emperor, was not in Rome. He was 250 kilometers north, behind the marshes and walls that made Ravenna defensible. In ways Rome no longer was, professional army that might have intercepted Alaric before he reached the city had not been paid. The senators who might have funded defence had already fled, taking their grain reserves with them. Cura annone. The grain dole that had fed 200,000 registered recipients had ceased functioning years before the Goths arrived. The shipments from North Africa had stopped, not because the farms had failed, because the imperial bureaucracy that managed the supply chain had disintegrated. Rome's population had collapsed from roughly 800, 00 at its height, to fewer than 150,000 by 410. The city Alaric entered was already a ghost of itself. Neighbourhoods abandoned, public buildings stripped of their bronze and marble by the city's own residents, decades before the first Goth touched the walls. When the Salarian Gate opened, the Visigoths were not breaching a living capital. They were entering a museum of a city that had been quietly dying for a century. The sack itself lasted 3 days. It was not the annihilation that later chroniclers imagined. Alaric's men took what they could carry. They burned some buildings, spared the churches. Alaric, whatever else he was, had been baptized as a Christian and respected the sanctuary of St. Peter's and St. Paul's. But the symbolic content of those 3 days matters more than the physical destruction. The Visigoths were not destroying Roman civilization. They were demonstrating, in the most theatrical way possible, that Roman civilization had already destroyed itself. The lead bullets are the emblem of that demonstration. The metal that carried water to senators' kitchens, a compound that sweetened their wine and stabilized their sauces and accumulated silently in their neural tissue. The infrastructure that made elite Roman life possible. The baths, the fountains, private water supply that marked the boundary between the powerful and everyone else. That metal, in the space of an afternoon, repurposed into the weapons that finished the city. The poison completed its circuit, what the ruling class had ingested slowly over centuries. Alaric's forges returned to them as high-velocity lead. The sack of 410 is not the end of the Western Roman Empire. That end would come 66 years later, in 476, when Odoacer, another Germanic federatus commander, would depose the child emperor Romulus Augustulus and send the imperial regalia to Constantinople, with a letter explaining that the West no longer required its own emperor. The sack is not even the most destructive event of the 5th century. The Vandals would do worse in 455, when they spent 14 days stripping Rome of everything portable. But 410 is the date that history remembers as the wound, because it is the date when the story Rome told about itself stopped functioning. For 1500 years, the question, who destroyed Rome, been answered by pointing at Alaric and his Visigoths and saying, them, barbarians, the invaders, the outside force that broke through the gates and brought down the greatest civilization the world had ever known. That answer collapses the moment you examine the evidence. The city Alaric entered had no emperor, no functioning grain supply, no professional army, and a population that had already shrunk by more than 80% from its peak. The state he was supposedly destroying had stopped collecting or solving enough tax revenue to fund its own military decades before he was born. The men firing lead bullets at the Basilica of St. Paul were Roman-trained soldiers settling Roman debts. The sack was a symptom, arriving with theatrical timing to be blamed for a death that had been in progress for 200 years. But there is another suspect in the dock, one that historians have been arguing about since 1776. Not a person, an idea that wears a cross. Edward Gibbon did not set out to offend anyone. He was a gentleman scholar in a London study, writing by candlelight, working through the evidence with the same Enlightenment confidence that had led his contemporaries to measure the orbit of Jupiter and classify the species of South America. He published the first volume of The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, 1776, and the central claim he made, the claim that has been argued about ever since, was that Christianity had weakened Rome, paused. Not that barbarians had overwhelmed the legions, not that lead had dulled the brains of the Senate. Cross had somehow made the eagle less willing to fight. The argument was specific. Gibbon pointed to the diversion of wealth. Temples closed, their revenues redirected to bishops and monasteries, rather than to the state treasury that paid for roads and soldiers. He pointed to the diversion of talent. Men who might have governed of provinces or commanded legions instead entered the clergy, devoting their administrative energy to theological disputes rather than imperial administration. And he pointed to a reorientation of loyalty. The Christian citizen, he argued, had been taught to see Rome as a temporary arrangement of no ultimate consequence. His true citizenship in heaven, true king, not the emperor but Christ. The civic religion that had held the Republic together for 5 centuries. The festivals, the sacrifices, the shared conviction that the gods had made Rome great, and would keep it great if Romans kept faith, was dismantled. What replaced it did not demand the same blood sacrifice for the state. The fiscal evidence is not in dispute. Theodosius I issued the Edict of Thessalonica in 380 AD, making Nicene Christianity the sole authorized religion of the empire. 12 years later, 392, he banned pagan worship entirely. Temples were closed or repurposed. Their endowments, land, precious metals, agricultural revenue, transferred to the church. The charitable functions that the state grain dole had once performed, feeding the urban poor, were increasingly absorbed by Christian charities, operating under episcopal authority. Whether this was a net loss to the state's capacity, or simply a transfer of the same functions to a different institution, is precisely the kind of question that has kept historians employed for 2 centuries. The money moved, question it. Whether the system that received it was more or less capable of sustaining an empire. Then there is the harder to measure, but equally real question of martial culture. Early Christian writing on military service is not ambiguous. Tertullian, writing around 200 AD, asked explicitly whether a Christian could serve in the legions, and answered with a question of his own: can a man who has renounced the world carry the sword of the world? The soldier's oath, the sacramentum, was sworn to the emperor as a divine figure, an act of idolatry for a Christian who acknowledged no god but one. Lactantius, the same writer who described tax assessors as more terrible than war itself, wrote that a Christian could not shed blood, could not participate in capital punishment, could not kill even in a just war. This position was never universal. There were Christian soldiers in the legions from at least the late 2nd century, and by the time of Constantine their numbers were substantial, but the theological tension existed. And Gibbon's argument was that it exerted a slow, erosive pressure on the willingness of the empire's most conscientious citizens to fight for it. 4th century compounded this problem with a series of doctrinal civil wars that consumed the attention of emperors and bishops alike. Constantine himself spent his final years embroiled in the Arian controversy, whether Christ was of the same substance as God the Father, or merely of similar substance, a distinction that seems theological to modern ears, but that generated riots, exiles, and imperial interventions that diverted administrative energy from frontier defence. Donatist schism in North Africa divided Christian communities into armed camps, with imperial troops deployed to suppress one faction or another. Whatever your view of the theology, the practical consequence that a substantial portion of Roman governing capacity was now directed at resolving arguments that the pre-Christian empire had not needed to have. Peter Brown, the great historian of late antiquity, spent much of his career constructing the counter-argument. He did not dispute the facts Gibbon cited. He disputed what they meant. The bishops, Brown argued, did not simply drain the state of talent. They stepped into roles the state was already abandoning when the local magistrate fled his curial obligations, when the tax collector burned his demand letters, when the provincial governor retreated to his latifundium and hired private guards rather than maintain public order. The bishop was often the last functioning administrator left in the city. He collected what taxes could still be collected. He organised grain distribution. He negotiated with barbarian commanders who had been living inside Roman borders for a generation, and who, in many cases, shared the bishop's Christian faith. The church, in Brown's reading, did not kill the Roman state. It inherited a dying patient, Hote, and kept some of its vital functions running long enough for the Middle Ages to begin. Augustine made essentially the same argument while the patient was still dying. Proud, the City of God, begun in 413 AD, 3 years after Alaric's sack, was written specifically to answer the pagan charge that Christianity had caused Rome's fall. Augustine did not deny that Rome had fallen. He denied that the fall was Christ's fault. Rome, he wrote, had been morally corrupt long before the Incarnation. Its gods had not made it virtuous. They had made it powerful. Power without virtue was merely organised crime on a continental scale. The sack of 410 was not divine punishment for abandoning Jupiter. It was what happens to earthly cities, which are by their nature temporary, fragile, and subject to the same cycles of rise and collapse that affect all human institutions. The Christian's job was not to save Rome. It was to build something that outlasted it. The chronological problem that neither Gibbon nor Brown fully resolves sits at the centre of this debate, like an unburied bone. Constantine converted in 312 AD. The Western Empire was not formally dissolved until 476. 164 years. The Eastern Empire, which was even more thoroughly Christianized, survived until 1453. If Christianity was the primary agent of collapse, Its mechanism is slower than any other named cause in the historical record. Slower than the debasement of the currency. Slower than the flight of the Curiales. Slower than the concentration of lead in the bones of the aristocracy. Slower than the Antonine and Cyprian plagues combined. A poison that takes 4 centuries to kill is difficult to distinguish from something the patient was already doing to itself. The truth that neither side of this argument wants to confront is that the evidence required to resolve it does not exist and cannot be recovered. We do not have survey data on what the average 4th century Christian legion believed about dying for Rome. We have one bishop preaching that a Christian cannot shed blood, and another bishop arming his congregation against raiders and telling them, God, defend the righteous. We have theological treatises written by men who never held a sword, and we have the graves of Christians buried with their military equipment, their witch veil wand, chiro, amulets clasped in the same hands that had held a Sparta. The inner lives of those soldiers, whether they fought with less conviction than their pagan grandfathers, whether they looked at the imperial eagles and saw something less sacred than the cross, are irrecoverable. They took that answer with them into the ground. The debate will never fully close. Not because historians are bad at their jobs, because the sources do not permit closure. What the debate does, what it has done since Gibbon's study in 1776, force a question that is larger than Rome. You have watched the evidence accumulate. The lead in the bones, the taxes uncollected, grain hoarded, the pipes melted into ammunition. You know that the Western Empire was already dying when the Visigoths reached the Salarian Gate. Gibbon asked whether Christianity accelerated that death. Brown asked whether Christianity slowed it. The evidence answers neither question definitively. But it does something more uncomfortable than settling the argument. It makes the argument unavoidable, and it leaves you holding both sides of it in the dark. In 476 AD, Germanic commander named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, a boy of perhaps 16 called Romulus Augustulus, and did not declare himself emperor. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, the diadem, the purple cloak, the ceremonial sceptre that had symbolized authority over 5 million square kilometers were packed into a courier's case and shipped east with a formal letter recognizing the Eastern Emperor Zeno as sole legitimate ruler of the Roman world. Odoacer styled himself Rex Italiae, King of Italy, and deferred to the court on the Bosporus. This was not conquest, it was the quiet administrative confirmation that the Western throne had become a formality. In Constantinople, the news produced something between satisfaction and indifference. The Eastern court had long treated the Western emperor as a troublesome junior partner, draining resources and generating requests for military aid while contributing nothing to the treasury that actually functioned. No courier was dispatched to restore the boy emperor. No expedition was assembled. The regalia were received, catalogued, and shelved. Constantinople had been absorbing the empire's economic and political centre of gravity since the day Constantine dedicated the city in 330 AD. Positioned at the hinge between Europe and Asia, it controlled the sea lanes that connected the Black Sea grain supply to the Mediterranean, and the overland routes that carried silk and spice from the Levant. When the western provinces contracted through the 4th and 5th centuries, Britain abandoned in 410, Gaul splintered, Spain penetrated by Vandals and Suevi. The Eastern Court retained continuous access to the commerce that generated taxable wealth, not because the East was luckier, because it had placed its capital on the jugular of the empire's trade routes, and never let go. The difference in survival cannot be explained by external pressure. The Eastern Empire faced the same threats that broke the West: Huns, Goths, Persians, eventually Arabs, and endured another 1,000 years, until a Turkish cannon finally breached the Theodosian walls in 1453. That is not coincidence. It is structural divergence. When Visigothic refugees crossed the Danube in 376, the East absorbed the initial shock, paid them off where necessary, and eventually redirected them westward. When Attila's Huns rampaged through the Balkans in the 440s, the East rebuilt the ravaged cities and kept its tax registers intact. The same storms hit both halves of the empire. One shattered, one bent and straightened. The fiscal numbers make the divergence concrete. Western tax revenues in Gaul and Spain fell by 60 to 70% from 3rd century levels. By 450 AD, the Western state budget deficit was estimated at 30 to 50% of revenue. That is not a state trimming expenses. A state is unable to pay its professional army, its road gangs, its grain shipments. The legions that guarded the Rhine and Danube were funded, when they were funded at all, by local landowners handing over silver directly to their own hired commanders. The Eastern Court, by contrast, maintained the gold solidus as a stable currency from Constantine onward, collected land taxes through a bureaucratic apparatus that had never dissolved, and fielded armies whose paymasters answered to Constantinople, not to provincial magnates. And then there is the lead. Multiple analyses of Eastern aristocratic skeletons, fewer in number than the Western sample, show significantly lower bone lead concentrations. The wealthy of Constantinople did not live in a lead-free world, but they used less of it in their food and drink. Eastern culinary traditions favoured ceramic and bronze cookware rather than the lead-lined vessels that sat in every Roman senator's kitchen. The Eastern elite drank less. Supper. Drew less water through lead pipes. Whatever cognitive decline the neurotoxin imposed on the Western ruling class, it operated at a lower dose on the men who governed from the Bosporus. The decision-makers who steered the East through the same 5th century crises were, on average, thinking with brains, less systematically compromised mind than the brains that had already surrendered the West. The administrative contrast is equally stark. The land tax system that Diocletian reformed in 293 AD, Jugatio Capitatio, tying land assessment to headcount, was maintained in the East by a centralised imperial bureaucracy that survived the 3rd century crisis intact. Provincial governors reported to the praetorian prefect, who reported to the emperor. Land registers were updated, revenues projected, deficits identified and addressed. In the West, the same tax system had been enforced by local curiales, the Aurelius Simpliciuses of every Italian Gallic town, who fled when the burden became impossible, taking the registers and the institutional knowledge with them. The Eastern Court could count what it was owed. Courts. The Western Court could not. And a government that cannot count, cannot govern, Odoacer's gesture in 476, was therefore not an act of destruction. It was a formal acknowledgement of a fact that had been true for at least a generation. the Western state no longer met the minimum requirements of a state. It could not pay its soldiers, feed its capital, maintain its roads, collect its taxes. The man who occupied the throne was a figurehead for a machinery that had already stopped. Sending the regalia to Constantinople was not surrender. It was returning borrowed equipment to the only institution still capable of using it. The difference between East and West was not geography, not luck, not the quality of the enemies they faced. It was a specific set of administrative choices about who would pay for the empire, and who would be permitted to stop. The East chose to enforce contribution from the people who benefited most. The West chose to let them walk away. Consequences of that choice are written in the ledgers. And the ledgers, as we will see, tell a story colder than any battlefield. The East had ledgers. That is not a metaphor. In the imperial archives of Constantinople, papyrus rolls and parchment codices recorded, district by district, the assessed value of every pugum, notional unit of land calibrated not to area, but to productive yield, and the name of every head counted under the cost capitatio. The system was Diocletian's, reformed in 293 AD, and its architecture was brutally simple. A iugum, first quality vineyard, might be 5 acres. A iugum, marginal grain land, might be 40. The assessment did not care what you grew. It cared what the land could produce in an average year, and it assigned a fixed tax obligation accordingly. The capitatio ran alongside it, counting able-bodied adults, men and women, and attaching a per-head charge that no amount of creative accounting could erase. Together, the two assessments generated a revenue projection the state could depend on. When an inspector visited a province in the east, he updated the register. When he left, the prefecture in Constantinople had a copy. When the prefecture's copy was reconciled with the treasuries, the emperor knew what the empire was worth. This system survived the 3rd century crisis. It survived the Gothic wars of the 370s. It survived Attila. It was still functioning in recognizable form when Justinian's tax assessors rode through Syria and Egypt in the 6th century. In the West, the same policy produced the opposite result. The Jugatio Capitatio was imposed on Italy, Gaul and Spain with the same legal language, but its enforcement fell not to a centralized imperial bureaucracy, but to local curialias, town councillors, men of middling wealth, legally bound to middling posts, and personally liable for any shortfall in their district's tax delivery. The mathematics of their position was unforgiving. When a neighbour's farm failed and the family fled, the crowd, curialis, still owed the assessment for that farm. When a wealthy senator acquired a dozen small holdings and converted them into a foster single latifundium, registered under a reduced valuation, or removed from the tax rolls entirely through personal influence, curialis still owed the original aggregate. When the currency debased and wheat prices rose 500-fold between 150 and 300 AD, the nominal tax demand did not adjust downward to match the real collapse in what farmers could pay. The curia realis filled the gap from his own estate. Then he filled it again the next year. Then his estate was gone. The Theodosian Code, issued in 379, formalized the trap. Curians who abandoned their posts would be brought back in chains, tortured, their property confiscated. Post. The law did not ask whether the post was survivable. It asked only whether the post was filled. So they fled. The Aurelius Simpliciuses of 100 provincial towns burned their demand letters and disappeared into the estates of the very senators, whose tax avoidance had made their jobs impossible. When a cor curialis fled, he took the register with him, not out of defiance, but because the register was the only record of who owed what, and without it, the state could not reassign his liabilities. The physical document that made taxation possible walked out the door in the arms of a desperate man. No replacement was trained. No copy existed in the provincial capital. The data infrastructure of the Roman West dissolved one frightened curialis to time. The divergence is visible in the fate of a single imperial edict. In 301 AD, Diocletian issued the edict on maximum prices, sweeping attempt to cap the cost of goods and labour across the entire empire. Cost. The edict was carved in stone and posted in marketplaces from Britain to Egypt. In the east, inscriptions survive in multiple cities. Fragments that show local officials attempted to enforce the caps, imperfectly, inconsistently, but with the apparatus of the state behind the effort. In the West, the edict is almost invisible archaeologically. In Gaul and Spain, no meaningful enforcement trace survives. The same emperor, the same law, the same year. One half of the empire had the administrative machinery to transmit the order and the personnel to attempt compliance. The other half had already lost the capacity to execute. The currency tells the same story in metal. The East, from Constantine onward, operated on the gold. Solidus, coin of reliable weight and purity that held its value for centuries. Lubricating trade from Alexandria to Antioch, to the harbours of the Aegean, chance merchants who dealt in solidi, could write contracts denominated in a unit that meant the same thing at both ends of the route. The West, by contrast, continued stumbling along on the debased silver denarius that had lost 95% of its silver content by 260 AD. The coin that arrived in a Gallic market town in 400 AD was a thin silver wash, bronze, worth a fraction of what its face claimed. Prices decoupled from value, long-term agricultural investment, the kind that requires a farmer to trust that next year's harvest will sell for a predictable sum, became irrational. You do not plant vines for a decade's yield when the currency might be worthless next spring. Nowhere is the consequence clearer than in the Egyptian grain markets, for which continuous price data survives. Wheat, that cost a stable sum in the 2nd century, rose 500-fold by 300 AD. That number is not purely inflation. It is the collapse of price information itself. When wheat prices swing that violently, no one can plan. The imperial grain shipments that fed Rome depended on contracts with Egyptian producers, contracts that assumed stable price over multi-year cycles. When the pricing signal was destroyed, the contracts became unenforceable, producers sold locally or hoarded, and the supply chain that had sustained the largest city in the ancient world broke at its source. Trade networks followed the currency. The East retained continuous long-distance commerce. Alexandria to Constantinople, Constantinople to Antioch, beyond to the Silk Roads, keeping tax revenue tied to the movement of goods through ports and toll stations. In the West, internal trade contracted as roads degraded, and banditry rose in the revenue vacuum. Road gangs require payment, maintenance requires revenue, revenue requires taxable commerce. When the roads ceased to be safe, the commerce ceased to travel. When the commerce ceased to travel, the toll stations generated less. When the toll stations generated less, the roads ceased to be repaired. The circle tightened until, by the 470s, physical infrastructure of the Roman West had reverted to a condition its 3rd century ancestors would have recognized as barbaricum. Comparison is not subtle. The East had centralized land registers, a functioning currency, maintained trade routes, host, and an enforcement bureaucracy that could impose contribution on the wealthy. West had local officials fleeing, with the only copies of tax records, a currency stripped of meaning, roads dissolving into mud, governing class that had decided, across generations in 1,000 daily evasions, that the cost of maintaining the state exceeded the value of what the state provided. The East asked, who owes and how much? The West, by the time Odoacer packed the regalia, lost the ability to ask the question. The ledgers were gone. Western Europe lost 15 to 20 million people in the 2 centuries following 400 AD. That is not an estimate pulled from thin air. It is the number no historian disputes, derived from settlement archaeology, pollen analysis, the slow, silent testimony of abandoned fields reclaimed by forest, pollen cores drawn from lake beds across Gaul and northern Italy show tree pollen surging exactly where cereal pollens had dominated for 4 centuries. Then land rewilding itself, because the farmers who worked it were simply gone. The population contraction was so severe that it would take 6 centuries to reverse. 6 centuries. The Black Death, for all its horror, wiped out 1/3 of Europe in 4 years. And populations recovered within 150. Rome's demographic hollowing was something else entirely. A sustained generation after generation erosion that emptied cities, shrunk cultivated land, and left whole provinces sparsely inhabited until the High Middle Ages. People who vanished left behind more than empty villages. They left behind the ability to read. In the urbanized Roman world, literacy rates probably reached 15 to 20%. Not universal, not egalitarian, widespread enough that a merchant in Gaul could write a contract. A centurion could read an order. Freedmen could scratch a graffito on a tavern wall. By the 7th century, that number stood at 1 to 2%. This was not a cultural preference for oral tradition. It was the physical disappearance of the institutions that made literacy functional. Schoolmasters were paid by town councils that no longer collected taxes. When the councils dissolved, the schoolmasters dispersed. Scribes worked for bureaucracies that no longer existed. When the bureaucracies collapsed, the scribes became peasants or monks. The supply chains that moved papyrus from Egypt to Gaul ceased to operate, and the writing material itself became scarce. In the span of 4 generations, the written word retreated from a civic skill into a clerical mystery, guarded behind monastery walls where most people never entered. In a municipal archive in northern Gaul, sometime around 480 AD, clerk locked a wooden chest containing the last tax register of his town. The entries were already 3 years out of date. He had no one to update them for. His superior had fled south a decade earlier. The man placed the key in a wall niche, covered it with a loose brick, walked out. The chest was not opened again for 400 years. When it was, the contents were dust. This is not a recorded event, Faust. It is the kind of event that left no record, which is precisely the point. The roads that had bound the empire together. 8,000 kilometers of paved, cambered, drained, mile-marked highway did not suffer some dramatic destruction. No barbarian army methodically tore up the flagstones. The roads died from neglect. Roman road maintenance was a line item on provincial budgets, funded by the same tax revenue that had already vanished. Road gangs received their pay from the state, bought their materials with state coin, and answered to state engineers. When the coin stopped, gangs dispersed. The gravel washed out of surface ruts, the drainage ditches clogged, and the roadbed softened into mud. Wheeled traffic avoided the worst sections, which made maintenance even less cost-effective, and the abandonment accelerated. Within a century of the last imperial road repairs in Gaul, sections of the Via Agrippa, the main artery from Lugdunum to the Channel, had reverted to rutted tracks, not bombed, not conquered, simply left. The aqueducts followed the same course. At its height, Rome's 11 aqueducts delivered roughly 1 million cubic meters of fresh water per day into the city. The Aqua Claudia alone ran 43 miles from source to distribution tank, gradient engineered, to drop 1 meter every 350 meters. That tolerance required constant inspection, constant clearing of sediment, a constant replacement of the lead collars that sealed the pipe joints. By 500 AD, none of the aqueducts functioned. Pipes had clogged. The settling tanks had filled with silt. Sections of elevated arcade had collapsed from frost cracking and root intrusion, and the water commissioner's office, that would once have dispatched a repair crew employing surveyors, masons, and leadcasters, simply did not exist. The engineer who understood the system died and trained knows no successor, because the state that had fallen had dissolved. The knowledge left with the person. 2 pandemics deepened the wound. The Antonine Plague, arriving with returning legions from the east in 165 AD, killed somewhere between 5 and 10 million people across the empire over 15 years. Roughly 10% of the population. A century later, the Cyprian Plague hit from 249 to 262 AD, striking an empire already convulsed by civil war and currency collapse. Kyle Harper, in The Fade of Rome, frames these epidemics not as independent catastrophes, but as compounding pressure. The tax base shrank, the labour pool contracted, fields went unplanted because there was no one to plant them, which reduced the harvest, which reduced the revenue, which reduced the state's capacity to respond to the next shock. The plagues did not cause the collapse. They ensured that when the collapse came, the margin for recovery had been burned away. Peter Heather's assessment crystallizes the sequence. The barbarians did not break a strong wall. External invasion was not the cause of Rome's failure. It was the mechanism through which a collapse already in motion became visible, elite withdrawal. The slow, multi-generational decision of the wealthy to stop contributing to the common institutions gutted the state's capacity to defend itself. By the time Alaric stood at the Salarian Gate, the wall had been dissolving for 200 years. He simply walked through the space where it used to be. The most specific loss cannot be measured in bodies or miles. It was the administrative memory of how to run a complex society. The institutional knowledge of how to move grain from Egypt to Ostia, store it in state granaries, and distribute it to 200,000 registered recipients. That knowledge was not written down in a single manual. It lived in the minds of the prefects, the clerks, the port inspectors, the bakers' guilds, the barge captains who knew the Nile channels in each season, the dock foreman who could calculate spoilage rates at a glance. When the prefecture collapsed, the clerks dispersed, the inspectors went unpaid, and the guilds lost their state contracts. The knowledge atomized into private households and monastery scriptoria. It was not reassembled for centuries. Land assessment, military recruitment, legal consistency, road repair, water management. Each of these functions required a living chain of trained people. When the chain broke, functions stopped. The Romans of 117 AD would have recognized the problem and mobilized the resources to fix it. Romans of 476 could do nothing about it. They had long since forgotten how to pay for anything at all. The final question, the one that turns on what we do with this evidence, is not about what disappeared. It is about who decided it was acceptable to let it disappear. Why the only people who had the resources to prevent the collapse chose. Across generations, and in full knowledge of the consequences, to let it happen. They have been walking through the ruins for 1600 years, looking for a single horseman, a single battle, a single date when everything changed. But the mechanism is not a moment. It is a sequence. State depends on its wealthiest citizens to fund its armies, its roads, its grain shipments, its courts. In return, citizens receive protection, legal title, and the enormous economic advantage of operating inside a system that enforces contracts and secures trade routes across 5 million square kilometres. That bargain held for centuries, not because Roman aristocrats were uniquely virtuous, because the state's capacity to punish defectors made cooperation cheaper than defection. When that capacity eroded, the bargain dissolved, not in one act of betrayal. Across generations, estate by estate, tax register by tax register, collapse appeared sudden to those living through its final decades. But the structural withdrawal had been underway for 200 years, invisible to participants who could see only their own balance sheets. Consider the Visigoths of 376 AD. 100,000 people, men, women, children, livestock gathered on the north bank of the Danube begging for entry. They were fleeing the Huns, genuine terror moving west across the steppe. Rome had handled migrations of this scale before. Augustus resettled entire tribes, registered them, taxed them, turned their young men into auxiliary soldiers. A fiscally intact empire with a functioning professional army would have processed the Visigoths as it had processed dozens of similar groups. Instead, the Roman officials assigned to manage the crossing. Lupicinus and Maximus, two names that survive only because of the disaster they engineered, saw a profit opportunity. They sold the refugees rotten grain at extortionate prices. They took Visigothic children as slaves, in exchange for dog meat. Corruption was not aberrant. Then, it was the predictable behaviour of administrators who knew no one in the imperial hierarchy would audit them because the audit infrastructure had already dissolved. Within 2 years, the Visigoths were in revolt. At Adrianople, they annihilated the Eastern Field Army and killed the Emperor Valens. 100,000 desperate refugees had been turned into 100,000 enemy soldiers, not by their own ambition, but by the systematic failure of the empire's administrative capacity to perform its most basic functions. A specific combination that made the Western collapse irreversible operated on 3 levels. At the top, ruling class, whose cognitive function had been compromised by chronic lead exposure, made systematically worse decisions over generations. Not one catastrophic error, but a steady degradation of the ability to plan, to calculate consequences, to see past the next fiscal quarter. In the middle, the tax system that should have funded the army and the bureaucracy was abandoned by the very people most able to sustain it. The wealthy acquired land, removed it from the tax registers, and used the savings to hire private security rather than contribute to the public military. At the bottom, when the state could no longer pay its soldiers or secure its frontiers, turned to the same Germanic groups it had failed to manage, hiring them as foderati, settling them inside the borders, eventually discovering that they answered to their own leaders and not to Ravenna. The military that had once been Rome's most potent institution became a collection of private armies, funded by private wealth, loyal to the men who wrote the checks. The public institution dissolved into a network of private arrangements, and nobody who had the power to stop the process had any incentive to do so. The question that remains is not historical. It is present. What happens to any system of collective governance when the people who benefit most from it decide that the cost of maintaining it exceeds the value, what it provides? Rome answered that question over 400 years. The answer is written in bone fragments, in burned tax letters, in lead bullets stamped with the name of the Republic. Those bullets were destroying. It is written in the pollen record of rewilded farmland and the empty aqueduct arches still standing in the Italian countryside, monuments to an engineering capacity that vanished, not because it was conquered, but because it was abandoned. The evidence does not predict the future. It simply asks whether the mechanism is recognizable